Eddie Van Halen changed the way an entire generation thought about the electric guitar. Two-handed tapping, dive bombs, the brown sound. He built a new vocabulary almost overnight. And by the time he was in his 60s, he'd had decades to reflect on the guitarists who shaped him, challenged him, and sometimes flat out rubbed him the wrong way. This isn't a story about a bitter man holding grudges. It's a story about ego, respect, and the strange tension that exists between heroes and the people who grow up to become their equals. Here are 6 guitarists whose names came up again and again when Eddie talked about friction in his career, in his own words on the record. Long before Eruption existed, Eddie Van Halen was a teenager in Pasadena with a cheap guitar and a stack of Cream records. He wasn't just a fan of Eric Clapton. He treated him like a private guitar teacher. In his first ever interview with Guitar Player in 1978, Eddie said his main influence, believe it or not, was Eric Clapton. Years later, he'd go even further, telling Guitar World he could play everything Clapton did by the time he was 14, working out the live version of Crossroads from the Cream album note for note. In a 2011 conversation with Rolling Stone, he called Clapton the only guitarist who had truly influenced him. That devotion never really faded, even after Eddie became a phenomenon in his own right. But the relationship between the two men wasn't just admiration from a distance. As Eddie's fame grew through the late 70s and into the 80s, he and Clapton actually met, and by most accounts became friendly, trading stories, talking gear, building the kind of rapport that comes from mutual respect between two guitarists at very different ends of the instrument's history. Brian May invited Eddie into the studio for his solo project Starfleet Project, and the two of them cut a loose, nearly 13-minute blues jam they called Blues Breaker, a title lifted straight from the John Mayall record that helped make Clapton's name in the first place. They dedicated it to him. It was meant as a tribute from two admirers to the man who helped invent the guitar hero. Clapton did not take it that way. Speaking to Musician magazine in 1986, he said the track left him almost insulted, describing it as a well-intentioned blues jam that missed the point of the genre entirely. No dynamics, no build, no restraint. The very things Clapton considered essential to playing blues with any authenticity. It was a pointed critique from a guitarist who had spent his whole career refining feel over flash, aimed at two players known for the opposite instinct. The comments stung, and by most accounts of people close to both guitarists, the friendship cooled noticeably afterward. It's a strange kind of heartbreak. Not a public feud, no dueling interviews, just two guitarists from different musical universes who briefly connected and then quietly drifted, one convinced he'd honored his hero, the other convinced his gift had been misunderstood. What never wavered on Eddie's side was the depth of the original influence. Decades on, when people questioned why a shred guitarist would cite a blues player as his foundation, Eddie's answer stayed consistent. Clapton was where it all started, whether people believed him or not. Eddie the guitar's vocabulary. Ritchie Blackmore taught him some of its physicality. The aggressive whammy bar work, the classically tinged riffing that turned Deep Purple's Burn and Highway Star into essential listening for a teenager obsessed with technique. In a 2011 Rolling Stone interview, Eddie specifically credited Blackmore's vibrato bar use on Deep Purple and Rock as something that changed how he thought about the instrument, and he never hid his admiration for Blackmore's riff writing either. Meeting his hero did not go the way Eddie hoped. By multiple accounts from people who were present, including keyboardist Don Airey, who later told the story on the Mullet Shag TV livestream, and journalist Stephen Rosen, who wrote a book about his decades-long friendship with Eddie, Blackmore's reputation for coldness with other musicians was very real, and Eddie ran straight into it more than once. Rosen has described a specific backstage introduction where Blackmore, apparently already aware of who Eddie was, greeted him with a dismissive line that cut the young guitarist to the bone. Rosen recalled that on the ride home afterward, Eddie didn't say a word, but it was obvious he was hurt. Blackmore's chilliness wasn't unique to Eddie. Musicians who worked with him for years described the same aloofness, And Blackmore himself later acknowledged, in a guitar player conversation, that his own insecurities and the pressures of the business played a role in how he carried himself in those years. What's notable is that Blackmore didn't stay cold forever. In later interviews, he spoke with real warmth about Eddie, calling him humble and describing him as someone who consistently underestimated his own ability. After Eddie's death in 2020, Blackmore issued a public tribute calling him the ultimate guitar hero and crediting him with starting a technique that reshaped an entire generation of players. That inverts the usual arc. The hero worship came first, the sting came in the middle, and the respect arrived fully and publicly, only at the very end. Van Halen's 1978 tour was Eddie's introduction to life among the guitarists he'd grown up idolizing, and it wasn't the welcome he expected. In a 1982 guitar player interview with Jazz Albrecht, one candid enough that Eddie asked the writer to hold parts of it back at the time, he talked about how it felt walking into rooms full of established rock guitarists as a virtual unknown. He specifically named Joe Perry of Aerosmith as someone who, in his words, would give me the shaft with their eyes, offering no hello, no warmth, nothing. Eddie framed it as a generational reflex rather than personal cruelty. His read, stated plainly in that same interview, was that guitarists like Perry wouldn't go out of their way to help a newcomer because they felt threatened by what he represented, a completely different, faster, more technical style crashing into a scene built on blues-based swagger and riff-driven groove. Perry's sound, thick and loose and steeped in 70s hard rock attitude, was about as far from Eddie's tapping and harmonic squeals as two guitarists could get. Eddie never turned the slight into a public grudge. If anything, his response revealed more about his own values than about Perry's. In that same interview, he made a point of saying he didn't care where he was playing, a stadium or a lounge, because the joy was in playing itself, not in status or approval. It's the usual arc. The hero worship came first, the sting came in the middle, and the respect arrived fully and publicly, only at the very end. Van Halen's 1978 tour was Eddie's introduction to life among the guitarists he'd grown up idolizing, and it wasn't the welcome he expected. In a 1982 guitar player interview with Jazz Albrecht, one candid enough that Eddie asked the writer to hold parts of it back at the time, he talked about how it felt walking into rooms full of established rock guitarists as a virtual unknown. He specifically named Joe Perry of Aerosmith as someone who, in his words, would give me the shaft with their eyes, offering no hello, no warmth, nothing. Eddie framed it as a generational reflex rather than personal cruelty. His read, stated plainly in that same interview, was that guitarists like Perry wouldn't go out of their way to help a newcomer because they felt threatened by what he represented, a completely different, faster, more technical style crashing into a scene built on blues-based swagger and riff-driven groove. Perry's sound, thick and loose and steeped in 70s hard rock attitude, was about as far from Eddie's tapping and harmonic squeals as two guitarists could get. Eddie never turned the slight into a public grudge. If anything, his response revealed more about his own values than about Perry's. In that same interview, he made a point of saying he didn't care where he was playing, a stadium or a lounge, because the joy was in playing itself, not in status or approval. Time changed Perry's tune considerably. In a 2013 interview picked up by Van Halen News Desk, Perry looked back on hearing Van Halen's debut album for the first time and described being floored by it, saying Eddie had taken everything he'd absorbed and put his own unmistakable stamp on it, effectively reinventing guitar playing. It's a familiar shape by now, cold shoulder in the moment, full-throated respect once the dust settled and the impact was undeniable. Boston's Tom Scholz was, on paper, nothing like Eddie Van Halen. An MIT-trained mechanical engineer who built his own gear and recorded Boston's debut album largely in his basement studio. Scholz approached guitar, tone, like a science problem to be solved with precision and patience. Eddie approached it like a live wire, chasing feel over formula. It's exactly the kind of contrast that should have produced mutual curiosity. Instead, it produced one of Eddie's more pointed on-record complaints. In that same 1979 guitar player conversation with Jazz Obrecht, where he discussed Rick Derringer, Eddie brought up a show where Van Halen played right before Boston. After Eddie finished his own solo, he said Scholes went out and played it back almost note for note in front of the same crowd. A moment Eddie described as real weird, made stranger by the fact that it happened in broad daylight with the whole audience watching him watch it happen. He didn't hide his irritation, admitting he was drunk and, in his words, pissed. Scholes never addressed the story publicly, consistent with a guitarist famously more comfortable behind a soldering iron than a microphone. That reserve was itself part of what frustrated Eddie. Multiple accounts describe him as someone who kept to himself before and after sets, offering little of the backstage camaraderie Eddie was known for extending to almost everyone he met on the road. Never escalated into anything public between the two men, and by most accounts it faded the way most tour circuit friction eventually does, into an anecdote rather than an ongoing feud. What lingers is the underlying point Eddie kept returning to across interviews throughout his career. Inspiration was fine, expected even, but he wanted people to build something of their own rather than trace his outline. Of all 6 guitarists on this list, Rick Derringer is the one Eddie actually removed from a tour over it. Derringer, a genuine rock veteran by 1978, having already scored hits with the McCoys and the Edgar Winter Group, was booked to open for Van Halen that year. According to the account Eddie gave Jazz Obrecht for a 1979 guitar player piece, Derringer went out one night and played Eddie's own solo, essentially note for note. Eddie confronted him afterward at the bar, and the exchange he recounted was direct. He told Derringer he'd grown up idolizing him and asked how he could turn around and do this. Reproducing the technique was one thing, but lifting the actual melody was something else entirely. By Eddie's telling, Derringer brushed it off, drunk and non-committal. The next night, he did it again, this time closing his own set with You Really Got Me, the same song Van Halen was using to close theirs. That was the last straw. Eddie told him plainly that if it kept happening, he wouldn't be opening for the band anymore, and then made good on it. The story landed harder than a simple professional dispute is what Eddie said right after telling it. He admitted the whole situation felt messy, because he himself had spent years earlier learning from watching Derringer play, essentially copying some of his own licks on the way up. It's a rare moment of Eddie acknowledging the same cycle from both sides, student and victim of the same kind of borrowing, within the space of one story. There's no record of a lasting public rift between them beyond that tour. What the episode captures is something closer to a boundary being drawn in real time, by a guitarist who was just becoming famous enough to realize a sound could be taken from him if he didn't protect it. No name on this list carries more weight or more sadness than Randy Rhoads. In the early 80s, Rhoads and Eddie were constantly compared. Two young, classically adjacent yet radically different guitarists redefining what rock guitar could sound like at almost exactly the same time. Rhoads through Ozzy Osbourne's band, Eddie through Van Halen. The tension between them surfaced most clearly in archival audio featured in the 2021 documentary, Randy Rhoads, Reflections of a Guitar Icon. In it, Eddie can be heard reflecting on Rhoads with a mix of respect and defensiveness, crediting him as an honest player who openly acknowledged learning from Eddie's